The conference room fell silent as 19-year-old Whitney Houston finished singing, but the words that came next would haunt record executive David Morrison for the rest of his life. "That voice is too churchy. It'll never work in pop music." What happened next became one of the music industry's most legendary mistakes. But what nobody knew was that this rejection would transform both Whitney's destiny and David's life in ways no one could have predicted. If you've ever been told you're not right for something, this story will change how you see rejection forever. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell because Whitney's journey from rejection to redemption will leave you speechless. It was March 15, 1983, and Columbia Records' headquarters in Manhattan was buzzing with the usual energy of deal-making and star-searching. David Morrison, the label's senior A&R executive, was running late for his 2 p.m. appointment. At 45, David had been in the music business for over 2 decades and had discovered some of the biggest pop stars of the 70s and early 80s. "She's got potential," his assistant Linda had told him earlier that morning, sliding a demo tape across his desk. "The girl's from Newark, gospel background, her mother's Sissy Houston." David knew the name. Sissy Houston was legendary in gospel circles, had sung backup for Elvis, and was part of the Sweet Inspirations. But that's exactly what concerned him. Gospel singers rarely made successful transitions to mainstream pop. When Whitney walked into that conference room, David's first thought was how young and nervous she looked. She was wearing a simple white dress, her hair pulled back, and she kept fidgeting with her hands. "Miss Houston," David said, barely looking up from his paperwork, "I understand you'd like to audition for Columbia Records." "Yes, sir," Whitney replied, her voice soft but clear. "I've been singing in my mother's church since I was 11, and I think I'm ready to try something different." Something different. Those words should have been David's first clue that he was about to witness something extraordinary. But his mind was already made up. Gospel singers were a hard sell in the pop market, and Whitney looked like every other church girl who thought she could make it in secular music. "All right," David sighed, checking his watch. "What are you going to sing for us today?" Whitney took a deep breath and launched into "Greatest Love of All." But this wasn't the version the world would later fall in love with. This was raw, unpolished, and filled with a spiritual power that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Her voice soared through the conference room like it was defying gravity itself. Every note was perfectly placed, every run was purposeful, and the emotion behind every word was so authentic it gave David chills. For 4 minutes and 37 seconds, Whitney Houston turned a sterile corporate conference room into a cathedral. When she finished, the room was dead silent. Whitney stood there, slightly out of breath, waiting for David's response. The 2 other executives in the room were staring at her like they'd just witnessed a miracle. But David Morrison wasn't thinking about miracles. He was thinking about market research, radio play, and demographic studies. He was thinking about everything except what he had just heard. "Miss Houston," David said, closing his folder with a definitive snap, "you have a powerful voice. I'll give you that. But it's too churchy for mainstream radio. Pop music right now is about accessibility, about sounds that make people want to dance and have fun. Your voice carries too much weight. It's too serious, too gospel." Whitney's face fell, but she maintained her composure. "Sir, I can sing different styles. I can adapt." "It's not about adapting," David interrupted, already standing to signal the meeting was over. "It's about having the right sound for the right market. And frankly, I don't see you fitting into Columbia's vision for the pop charts." The rejection was swift and brutal. Whitney gathered her things, thanked David politely, and walked out of that conference room carrying the pain of being told her greatest gift wasn't good enough. But here's what David Morrison didn't know. He had just made the biggest mistake of his professional career. And Whitney Houston was about to prove that some voices are too powerful to be contained by anyone's narrow vision. What happened next would change everything, not just for Whitney, but for David himself in ways he never could have imagined. 3 months later, David was sitting in his office when Linda burst through the door with barely contained excitement. "David, you need to see this," she said, slapping a copy of Billboard magazine on his desk. "Remember that gospel girl from Newark? Whitney Houston?" David looked down at the magazine cover. There was Whitney, radiant and confident, with the headline, "Arista Records' New Sensation." The article detailed how Clive Davis had signed Whitney immediately after hearing her demo, calling her the voice of a generation. Clive Davis signed her? David asked, his stomach dropping. Clive Davis was legendary. He had discovered and developed some of the biggest artists in music history. If Clive saw something in Whitney that David had missed. There's more, Linda continued. Her debut single just hit the charts. It's called You Give Good Love, and it's climbing fast. David felt sick. He had rejected what Clive Davis called the voice of a generation, but even then, he convinced himself it was a fluke. One hit didn't make a career, but Whitney wasn't done proving him wrong. Over the next 2 years, David watched in amazement and horror as Whitney Houston became everything he said she could never be. You Give Good Love hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. Saving All My Love for You went to number 1. How Will I Know dominated MTV. Greatest Love of All, the same song she had sung in his conference room, became an anthem. Every time David heard Whitney's voice on the radio, he was reminded of his colossal mistake. But what tortured him most wasn't just that he had been wrong about her commercial potential. It was that he had tried to diminish something pure and beautiful simply because it didn't fit his narrow understanding of what music should be. The breaking point came in 1987 when Whitney's second album, Whitney, became the first album by a female artist to debut at number 1 on the Billboard 200. David was driving home from work when I Want to Dance with Somebody came on the radio. As Whitney's joyful, soaring voice filled his car, David had to pull over to the side of the road. He sat there in his car, listening to the voice he had rejected, and finally understood the magnitude of what he had done. He hadn't just missed signing a talented singer, he had dismissed a gift from God because it didn't conform to his limited vision of what music should sound like. That night, David couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Whitney's face in that conference room, how young and hopeful she had looked, and how his words had crushed that hope. He thought about all the other artists he might have rejected over the years for similar reasons. How many gifts had he dismissed because they didn't fit his formula? The next morning, David Morrison made a decision that would change the rest of his life. He walked into his supervisor's office and submitted his resignation from Columbia Records. After 22 years in the mainstream music industry, David was done trying to fit square pegs into round holes. He was done telling artists their authenticity wasn't marketable enough. What are you going to do? His supervisor asked, shocked by David's sudden departure. I'm going to find my way back to what music is supposed to be about, David replied. I'm going to find my way back to the church. David Morrison didn't just quit his job. He embarked on a complete spiritual and professional transformation. Using his life savings and severance package, he founded Miracle Records, a label dedicated exclusively to gospel and inspirational music. But this wasn't just any gospel label. David's vision was to find artists like Whitney, singers whose voices carried that same spiritual power and authenticity, and give them a platform without asking them to compromise their gift. The label's motto, printed on every album cover, read, "Some voices are meant to heal the world exactly as they are." Miracle Records' first signing was a 16-year-old girl from Atlanta named Sarah Williams. Sarah had been rejected by 3 major labels for being too emotional and too intense. When David heard her sing, he immediately thought of Whitney Houston in that conference room in 1983. Sarah, David told her during their first meeting, I want you to sing exactly like you sing in church. Don't change a note, don't soften a run, don't hide any of that power. The world needs to hear your voice exactly as God gave it to you. Sarah Williams became Miracle Records' first platinum artist. Her album Healing Rain spent 42 weeks at number 1 on the gospel charts and crossed over to mainstream success without compromising a single note of its spiritual authenticity. Over the next 5 years, David discovered and developed 12 major gospel artists. But more importantly, he created a sanctuary in the music industry where authentic, spiritual voices could flourish without being asked to diminish themselves. David's approach was revolutionary. Instead of trying to make gospel artists sound more pop, he focused on the storytelling, the emotion, and the pure vocal talent that made them special. He invested in the best producers, the best studios, and the best marketing campaigns, proving that you didn't have to compromise artistic integrity to achieve commercial success. The transformation in David's own life was equally profound. He started attending church regularly for the first time since childhood. He began studying the spiritual roots of American music, gospel, blues, soul, and understanding how that foundation had influenced everything from rock and roll to hip-hop. Most importantly, David learned to listen, really listen, not to market research or demographic data, but to the human soul expressing itself through voice and song. But David still carried the guilt of rejecting Whitney Houston. Every success at Miracle Records was bittersweet because it reminded him of the one artist he had failed to recognize when it mattered most. That changed on a Tuesday afternoon in November 1992. David was in his office reviewing demo tapes when his secretary buzzed the intercom. "Mr. Morrison, there's a phone call for you. The caller says her name is Whitney Houston." David's heart stopped. Whitney Houston was calling him personally? After nearly 10 years, why would she want to talk to the man who had rejected her so cruelly? "Put her through," David said, his hands trembling as he picked up the phone. "Hello, David." Whitney's voice was warm and unmistakably hers. "This is Whitney Houston. I hope you remember me." "Of course I remember you, Whitney," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I owe you an apology that's about 9 years overdue." Whitney's laugh was gentle and forgiving. "Actually, David, I called to thank you." "Thank me?" David was confused. "Whitney, I rejected you. I told you your voice was too churchy for pop music. I was wrong about everything." "No, David, you weren't completely wrong," Whitney said. "My voice is churchy. It is rooted in gospel. It is serious and carries weight. But you taught me that those things aren't flaws to be hidden. They're gifts to be celebrated." Whitney explained that his rejection had forced her to find people who understood her gift. It led her to Clive Davis, who saw her church background as an asset, not a liability. It motivated her to prove that authentic, spiritual voices could dominate the mainstream. "David, I heard about Miracle Records," Whitney continued. "What you're doing for gospel artists, creating a space where they don't have to compromise, that's beautiful. That's exactly what the music industry needs." David was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he listened to the woman whose career he thought he had damaged tell him that his rejection had actually helped her find her true path. "There's something else," Whitney said. "I'm working on a gospel album, my first since signing with Arista. It's going back to my roots, back to the church music that shaped me. I want you to produce it." David couldn't speak. Whitney Houston, one of the biggest stars in the world, was asking the man who had rejected her to produce her gospel album. "Whitney, I don't deserve this opportunity," David finally managed to say. "We all deserve second chances, David," Whitney replied. "Besides, you understand gospel music now in a way you didn't 10 years ago. You understand what it means to let a voice be authentic. I think we could create something really special together." The album they created together, He Leadeth Me, was released in 1998. It featured Whitney at her most authentic, no pop production tricks, no attempts to broaden her appeal. Just the voice, supported by traditional gospel arrangements and David's deep understanding of spiritual music. The album was a critical and commercial success, but more importantly, it represented a full-circle moment for both Whitney and David. The voice he had once called too churchy was now being celebrated precisely because of its church roots. During the recording process, David and Whitney developed a genuine friendship. She often talked about how his rejection had been a blessing in disguise, forcing her to find her true artistic home. David shared how starting Miracle Records had reconnected him with his own spiritual foundation and helped him understand what music was really supposed to do: heal, inspire, and uplift. "You know what the difference is between us now and that day in 1983? Whitney asked David during one of their recording sessions. "What's that?" David replied. "Back then, you were listening with your head. Now you listen with your heart. And I was singing to prove something to the world. Now I sing to share something with the world. We both learned that authenticity doesn't need anyone's approval to be powerful." The success of He Leadeth Me established David as one of the premier gospel producers in the industry. Over the following years, he worked with dozens of artists, always with the same philosophy: find the authentic voice and let it shine exactly as it is. Miracle Records became a haven for artists who had been told they were too much or not right for mainstream music. David's story became legendary in gospel circles. The A&R executive who rejected Whitney Houston and learned to never silence another authentic voice. But David's transformation went beyond professional success. He became a mentor to young artists, teaching them that rejection from people who don't understand your gift isn't a verdict on your worth. It's a redirection toward people who do. In 2003, 20 years after rejecting Whitney Houston, David Morrison was inducted into the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. In his acceptance speech, he told the story of that day in 1983 and how it changed his life. I once told the greatest voice of our generation that she was too churchy for pop music, David said to the audience. I was wrong about the pop music part, but I was right about the churchy part. Whitney Houston's voice was churchy. It was filled with the power and authenticity that only comes from a genuine spiritual foundation. My mistake wasn't hearing that in her voice. My mistake was thinking that was a weakness instead of her greatest strength. David looked out at the audience of gospel music professionals and continued. Every artist in this room has probably been told at some point that they're too this or too that for mainstream success. Let me tell you something I learned from Whitney Houston. Being too authentic is not a flaw. It's exactly what the world needs. The audience erupted in applause, but David wasn't finished. Whitney Houston didn't become successful despite being churchy. She became successful because she was churchy, because she never lost that spiritual foundation that gave her voice its power. She taught me that our job isn't to change authentic voices to fit the market. Our job is to find the market that appreciates authentic voices. After the ceremony, David received a handwritten note from Whitney. Congratulations, David.